It sounds like the kind of story people invent on the internet. A rumor that spreads because it is too strange to check. A man caught in the deadliest explosion the world had ever seen, who somehow survived. That alone would already sound unbelievable. But the real part of the story is what comes next. In August of 1945, during the final days of World War II, a Japanese engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi was finishing a routine business trip in Hiroshima. Nothing about that morning suggested history was about to bend in a way no one had ever witnessed. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the sky detonated. In a single flash, the first atomic weapon used in war. Part of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki exploded above the city. Buildings vanished, shadows burned into walls, and tens of thousands of people disappeared in seconds. Yamaguchi was only a few kilometers from the blast, and against every possible O-day, he survived. The morning had started like any other. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had spent several months working in Hiroshima as part of a shipbuilding project for the company Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. That day was supposed to be his last in the city. His bags were practically packed, and his train back home was scheduled for later that morning. But as he walked toward the shipyard, he suddenly realized something. He had forgotten his official work seal, a small stamp required for company documents. It seemed like a minor inconvenience, the kind of thing that makes you turn around and retrace your steps for a few minutes. So Yamaguchi headed back to retrieve it. That tiny decision, a simple forgotten stamp, changed exactly where he would be standing at 8:15 a.m. Just moments later, the bomb nicknamed Little Boy detonated high above Hiroshima, unleashing a blinding flash and a pressure wave powerful enough to flatten nearly everything in its path. Yamaguchi never even heard the explosion. He only remembered seeing the sky turn white. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. Tsutomu Yamaguchi looked up and saw what he later described as a brilliant white flash tearing across the sky above Hiroshima. Instinctively, he dropped to the ground. Then the shockwave arrived. The force of the blast hurled him through the air, tearing his eardrums and burning the skin on one side of his body. The landscape around him transformed instantly. Buildings collapsed, windows shattered, and a towering column of smoke and fire began rising over the city. When Yamaguchi regained consciousness, the world looked almost unrecognizable. Fires were spreading everywhere. People wandered through the ruins in silence, many injured, many in shock, trying to understand what had just happened. But somehow, incredibly, he was still alive. With burns on his arm and face, and barely able to hear, he began walking through the destroyed city, searching for a way to escape the devastation unleashed by the first blast of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The city around Tsutomu Yamaguchi had turned into something almost impossible to describe. Streets he had walked just hours earlier were now buried under debris and fire. In every direction, Hiroshima looked like it had been erased. Despite the burns on his arm and the ringing silence in his ears from ruptured eardrums, Yamaguchi kept moving. His only thought was getting out of the city. Along the way, he encountered two co-workers who had also survived the blast. Together, they searched for any functioning transportation. Miraculously, some train lines on the outskirts were still operating, damaged, chaotic, but running. By the next morning, battered and bandaged, Yamaguchi boarded a train heading home. Home was in Nagasaki. After surviving the most powerful weapon ever used in war, he believed the worst was behind him. All he wanted now was to report what had happened and recover. What he didn't know was that history wasn't finished with him yet. When Tsutomu Yamaguchi finally arrived back in Nagasaki, he was exhausted, burned, and barely able to hear. Doctors wrapped his injuries, but by the next morning he still insisted on going to work. It sounded absurd even then, a man who had just survived the destruction of Hiroshima, returning to the office like any ordinary day. At the headquarters of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, his supervisors struggled to believe the story. Yamaguchi tried to explain it anyway. The flash, the wind that flattened an entire city, the sky turning into something no one had ever seen before. His manager reportedly interrupted him. There's no way a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Yamaguchi began describing the moment again. The light in the sky, the blast, the silence afterward. And right in the middle of that conversation, something outside the window began to glow. Before we continue, subscribe if you enjoy real stories that sound completely impossible, because what happened next turned this account into one of the strangest true stories of the entire atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., the sky above Nagasaki erupted in another blinding flash. The second atomic bomb, part of the same operation that had destroyed Hiroshima just 3 days earlier, detonated above the city. In an instant, the building where Tsutomu Yamaguchi stood was violently shaken by the blast wave. Windows exploded. Walls cracked. The shock threw people to the ground. For the second time in 3 days, Yamaguchi dove for cover as the world outside turned white. Amazingly, the structure of the office partially shielded him from the worst of the explosion. The injuries he had suffered in Hiroshima were already severe, but this time, the blast did not hit him directly. When the shaking stopped, the city outside was once again burning. 2 different cities, 2 different atomic bombs, and Tsutomu, the same man, had survived both moments of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the days that followed, the scale of what had happened began to slowly emerge. 2 cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had been devastated by weapons the world had never seen before. Entire neighborhoods were gone, and tens of thousands of lives had vanished in seconds. Somewhere inside that unimaginable disaster was the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. At first, when he told people what had happened, many assumed it was confusion caused by trauma. Surviving 1 atomic blast already sounded impossible. Surviving 2 sounded like something from fiction. But investigators and historians later confirmed the timeline. Company records, travel logs, and medical reports all aligned. Yamaguchi had indeed been in Hiroshima on August 6th, and back at work in Nagasaki on August 9th. Both cities, both bombs, and somehow still alive after the events of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Decades later, historians began carefully revisiting survivor records from the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many people had experienced the aftermath of both explosions, indirectly evacuations, radiation exposure, or travel between cities. But one case stood out as uniquely documented: the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Government archives, medical documentation, and employment records from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries all confirmed the same sequence of events. He had been in Hiroshima when the first bomb detonated, survived, traveled home, and then experienced the second explosion in Nagasaki 3 days later. In 2009, the Japanese government officially recognized him with a rare status known as Niyahibakusha, meaning someone who survived 2 atomic bombings. It made Yamaguchi the only person formally acknowledged to have lived through both detonations. A story that sounds like exaggeration, but is documented history. When people first hear this story, the immediate reaction is disbelief. Surviving a single atomic blast already pushes the limits of probability. Surviving 2 sounds like something written for a movie script. But the explanation lies in a combination of timing, distance, and pure chance. During the first explosion over Hiroshima, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was roughly 3 kilometers from the detonation point, close enough to suffer severe burns and injuries, but just far enough to avoid the immediate lethal effects at the center of the blast. 3 days later, when the second bomb exploded over Nagasaki, he was again positioned at a distance and partially shielded inside a reinforced building. It wasn't immunity. It wasn't resilience. Beyond human limits, it was an almost impossible alignment of circumstances during the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a rare intersection of survival, timing, and geography. Which is exactly why the story feels invented, even though every detail is documented. After the war, Tsutomu Yamaguchi quietly rebuilt his life in Nagasaki. For many years, he rarely spoke publicly about what he had experienced. Like thousands of other survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he focused on work, family, and moving forward. But as time passed, his story began to gain attention, precisely because it sounded so unlikely. Surviving the destruction of Hiroshima should have been the defining event of a lifetime. Yet somehow, history placed him in the path of the second atomic explosion as well. In later years, Yamaguchi chose to speak openly about those days, not to highlight his own survival, but to describe the reality of what nuclear weapons do to ordinary people and ordinary cities. He lived until 2010, reaching the age of 93. And his story remains one of the most improbable yet fully documented accounts of survival ever recorded, a real event so extraordinary that, even today, many people assume it must be fiction.